Please start.
Yeah. Well, good evening, everyone from India. I am Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director of Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi. On behalf of the Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies at Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi, and the Rising Powers Initiative at the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, George Washington University, Washington, DC, it is my great pleasure this evening to host this panel discussion on the new US administration and New Hope, views from the prism of Indo US relations. With the turn of the 20th century, the bilateral relations between India and US turned towards an upward trajectory with warmth, cooperation, and strategic understanding across a range of economic and political areas. This multifaceted, transformed relationship is promising as the global order of the 21st century evolves. With shared democratic values, commitment to freedom, respect for human rights, and the rule of law being permanent considerations as the basis for strengthened bilateral relationship, we have witnessed an extraordinary deepening of US-India strategic ties over the last 4 years during the Trump administration. With Joseph Biden set to assume presidency on 20th January 2021, there is a need to understand and to look at the approach of India and US to make bold decisions so that the bilateral ties bear full fruit in the years ahead. And at the moment of prevailing pandemic, there is enormous amount of work to be done at the highest levels, be it combating COVID-19 pandemic to universal inoculation, or even the changing climate and also the Chinese aggression in India's frontiers as well as in the Indo-Pacific. So to take stock of these issues and also assess on where does India-US relations stand at present and where we ought to go, I'm delighted to introduce to you 3 experts who are deeply involved in studying the different trajectories and facets of US-India relations, and whom we have invited this evening to present their thoughts and insights on what kind of hopes can we really have with the new US administration when it comes to India. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our first guest this evening, Professor Deepa Ollapally. She's an Associate Director and Research Professor of International Affairs in the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University, Washington, DC. She also directs the Rising Powers Initiative that tracks and analyzes debates in aspiring powers of Asia and Eurasia. Professor Ollapally specializes in Indian foreign policy, Sino-Indian relations, and also Asian regional and maritime security. She holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University. Good morning and welcome, Professor Ollapally. Our next guest this evening is Mr. Richard Rossow, Senior Advisor and Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, at Washington, DC. He plays an instrumental role in helping frame and shape policies to promote greater business and economic engagement between India and US. Mr. Rossow has also been at the helm of McLarty Associates as the Director of South Asia, New York Life Insurance as the Head of International Governmental Affairs, and also at the US-India Business Council as its Deputy Director. Mr. Rossow holds a BA from Grand Valley State University in Michigan. Good morning and welcome, Mr. Rick. And finally, we are joined by Professor KP Vijay Lakshmi, Professor of United States Studies at the Center for Canadian, United States and Latin American Studies at the School of International Studies, JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She specializes in US government and politics, India-US relations, comprehensive and non-traditional security, Indian diaspora, and US strategies and policies in South Asia. She has received prestigious awards like the Ford Foundation Faculty Fellowship, Senior Fulbright Postdoctoral Fellowship, Salzburg Seminar Fellow, the Olive J. Reddick Award, and the Gilner Award. Professor Vijay Lakshmi holds a PhD in American Studies from the School of International Studies, JNU. As your proud former MPhil and PhD student, I welcome you, ma'am, and I wish you a very good evening. Before we get on to the proceedings for today, there are some housekeeping announcements. The first round, where the panelists would present their perspectives on the topic of the day for about 10 minutes each. The second and third round would be interactions with the moderator, that is me, and an intra-panel discussion for a total of about 30 minutes. And finally, we'll take questions from the audience for 10 to 15 minutes and then formally conclude. So I request the audience attending on Zoom and also on Facebook Live to post their questions on the chat box. So thank you so much. Again, a warm welcome, and I will now yield the floor to Professor Deepa Ollapally for your views on the likely contours of US foreign policy towards India, factoring in the national interests of the US. Over to you, Professor Ollapally.
Thank you so much, Simi, and thank you for organizing this panel. I'm really happy to be re-engaging with my colleagues, especially from India, my old friend, KP Vijayalakshmi. And I want to start off because I'm going to be kicking this off with some broad questions that I want to ask. But you've asked me to look a little bit into the crystal ball, as it were, because we don't really have a full picture of what the Biden administration will be doing. And as a political scientist, making predictions is always a hazardous thing to do. So really, these are my speculations about how the Biden change of guard in Washington is likely to affect the strategic relations between US and India. So I'm going to just start off with five very direct questions, and they'll be broad brushed because I can't, and I'm happy to go into them in more detail in the Q&A and discussions. But first question is, where will India fall in the Biden priority, strategic priority? Secondly, how will it fit into the Biden's outlook on China? Third, on Indo-Pacific, these two things I think are very key to the relationship. And then very quickly, what are the key opportunities and challenges that I see? As I said, I'm going to be quite quickly going through these things and look forward to a bigger discussion after that. So where will India fall into strategic priorities of the new administration? You know, this morning I was scanning the news and there was a lot of statements about the fact that it looks like, given the kind of appointments that Biden is making, it may be just another third term of Obama. Let me say that I don't agree with that. And the reason is that the world of 2020 is not the world of 2012 or 2016. It's a very different kind of world. And so whatever your worldviews or your philosophies are that you come in with, often they're going to be conditioned by the circumstances that you face. And I think, you know, you have a group of Blinken, Sullivan, Austin at the top foreign policy strategic helm. Regionally speaking, none of them have a Asia experience, so to speak, specifically, or let alone India. But at the same, and so what I would say, they are much more Europeanist and Middle East. That's been their main focus. Having said that, though, they do come out, most of them have worked directly in one way or the other in the Biden administration. They do come out of the Obama administration, which of course set India and US on an extremely good trajectory, gained enormous momentum during his time. And so I think they are India's importance doesn't have to be, you know, argued in front of the Biden team. They know the importance. And I think we can say that at this point, India has the US sees India as a key strategic partner, whoever is in power. Now, having said that, I think what we have to watch for is, given the changed circumstances and the huge uncertainties that all the countries are facing, but in Asia in particular with China and the economic crisis and so forth, and the pandemic, I think we have to see how Mr. Biden and Mr. Modi are going to adapt to these changing circumstances, and to what extent their strategic priorities will align or not. But in any case, it's not going to be an Obama third term. That's and in terms of strategic alignment, let me then look at my second question. How closely do I think they're going to align on China? And this is, again, extremely important given the kind of standoff that India has right now with China on the border. I think it's in trying to anticipate the Biden-China policy, I think it's safe to say that Biden will be trying to reestablish some genuine stability in the relationship. If we want to, so stability is going to be an overriding factor for Biden, which was not the case for Trump, which is much more of a disruptive outlook. And if we want to talk in terms of China hawks or China doves in the Biden administration, I don't see a lot of China hawks in the lineup so far. For example, if you look at Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, presumptively, just last year during the presidential campaign, he said that he thought that the US was having too much of a tough policy on China. I think the Biden administration would prefer not to do anything too strongly against China. They don't want a confrontation. And I think Blinken and Sullivan probably see China more as an economic and technological competitor than a military competitor. And so they're going to avoid confrontation as much as possible. That said, there seems to be a counter narrative from some of Biden's close advisors. And here I would mention Kurt Campbell, who served under Obama as well, who seem to be much less tolerant of Chinese behavior and coercive actions now. And he's been arguing that the US should be taking more effort to reassure allies and friends, and that to show that US has not vacated its security role in the region. So I think they are more hawkish on China. At the same time, what we've also seen is the media, the public have moved toward more anti-China views. The Republicans still control the Senate. And so the question is, again, to what extent Biden, because he has to get a lot of domestic packages approved, whether he will be willing to compromise on some of the hardline China policies as well. And the other thing is, so, whatever the drivers are, I think politically, there's a lot of reason for Biden to keep some of Trump's policies toward China. I think even some of the Democrats are seeing that some Trump tactics might actually have been effective. So we are not going to see a repeat of Obama policies. What we will see, I think, at least on China, we will see a Obama plus some elements of Trump. And so in that sense, I think the alignment between Indian strategic outlook and US outlook on China could be actually quite close at the end of the day. Now, just as an aside, China can play a role in this. It can either, it can perhaps reach out, grand gesture, cooperative gesture to win over the new administration, or conversely, it could test the new administration in South China Sea and Taiwan, whatnot. And so it could go either way. So I think we have to be watching for China's role on that as well. The third point is on the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is something that I think there's a lot of convergence. And why? Well, it was under the Obama administration, Biden administration, that the Indo-Pacific concept was conceptualized and pushed. And the whole idea behind that was the Indo side. They already had the Pacific going very well. The idea that adding Indo-Pacific, the Indo side, that was an Obama construction, Hillary Clinton construction. And so that I think is not lost on any of these key appointees in Biden administration. And, on that, Mr. Modi and Mr. Biden are going to have very little problem coming together. In fact, I think what the Trump administration has done is to leave a very solid set of record for Biden and Modi to move forward. And under Trump, they managed to get two very important, what are called foundational defense agreements passed, COMCASA and BECA, which are both, and in addition to another agreement, LAMOA, that had been signed earlier, these three have set the stage for a kind of an order of magnitude change in the kind of cooperation that you can have in secure, in high-end encrypted information, data that is that classified data that allows India to have a much higher level military grade information that it did not have before access to. It was usually commercial and so forth. So it didn't have that. This is a very, these things were very difficult things to accomplish, but it did happen under the Trump administration, and Biden therefore is inheriting a good situation. One quick thing on the Indo-Pacific is the Quad. Under recently, there was a naval exercise, the Malabar naval exercise, that had been up to now with 3 of the Quad members, US, India, Japan. This time, Australia joined after 13 years, and it just happened in November. So I think that is a big change to show that so far people had been saying the Quad, what is it? It's just an idea, just a talk shop, but now you're seeing some real teeth to that. And I think on the Indo-Pacific, the other thing that Biden, I think, brings to the table is an eagerness to work with partners and alliances. And I think in this case, it's not just rhetoric. I think they will listen to important partners, unlike the Trump administration, which tended to railroad or just drive through what they wanted. And so I think, India will be an important partner in that. And since India has a lot of, shall I say, unique approaches, it's important that communication actually happen very effectively. The other thing about the Indo-Pacific is Japan. The Biden team is very, very close to Japan. They're interested in Japan. And of course, India and Japan are very, very close and getting closer. So I think there's a virtuous triangle here, US, India, Japan, that's going to keep going. Very quickly, opportunities, I'm just going to literally now just list a couple of them. And I think others will say this as well. Afghanistan, I think it's an opportunity under Biden. Iran, nuclear deal, another opportunity. And bilateral defense cooperation with all the different agreements that have been signed. Very quickly on challenges. To me, this might be more in Rick's topics, but I think I see the challenges lying more in economics. And I raise it because I think if we think of economics as a leading edge of strategic policy, then I think we could be facing some real headwinds here in terms of protectionism, in terms of some of the things that the Trump administration has already set in motion with immigration, with the visas and so forth. And to what extent can Biden really roll those back? I'll be interested to hear what Rick has to say on that. The other thing is that, coming back to the Indo-Pacific for a second, what is shocking is that the US and China are the two big countries that are out of the two most important regional economic pacts to come out in the last few years, the RCEP and the CPTPP. This is going to set the standards for the next generation, standards on trade and investment. The fact that these two countries are sitting it out is quite a big glaring gap. The other final thing is that I think a challenge is lies in the, ironically in some sense, in the values and social questions, because I think Biden comes in with a very strong normative agenda on democracy. And I think India's erosion in that regard is going to be something that they'll have to deal with. I'm sorry, I've gone over my time, but over to you, Rick.
No issues, no issues. Thank you, Professor Ollapally. Thank you for comprehensively putting up the broad contours of where Indo US relations are headed towards. So I now invite Mr. Rick Rossow to offer his remarks, particularly on the economic and commercial sides of the relationship, because in many ways, this is an important driver in the intensified engagement between the two countries. So your views, Mr. Rick.
Great. Well, yeah, as Deepa hinted, I get to be the downer, I think, compared to the relative upside that we've seen on defense and security. Simi, if you'll allow, I think I'll talk a bit about how we got here before I touch on some of the things I think we may see going ahead. It's been a pretty rough patch, at least between our governments, when we think about economic relations in the last number of years. Going back 6.5 years ago to when Prime Minister Modi was elected to office, we've seen India take a more trade protectionist bent than we really have seen by any leader in India since the 91 reforms began. And that's specifically on goods trade. You've seen a return to imposing higher customs duties, a range of import substitution rules that have been adopted across multiple industries, where if you're not producing locally, you can't secure contracts in some sectors, an expanding list of sectors. So a real set of trade protections that has caused real friction with the United States even before President Trump came to office. Now you pair that with the fact that Prime Minister Modi is also at the same time the most pro-investment leader India's had in its entire history, dramatically reducing barriers to investment, FDI caps, moving on that faster than any of his predecessors had done, simply embracing foreign investors. These investor shows where you see them on stage, talking up CEOs and all that. Even that kind of visible courtship of foreign investors had been considered a pretty danger zone for Modi's predecessors, even while privately they certainly wanted to see foreign investors come in. Now with President Trump's election 4 years ago, you had a US leader come to office that was willing to fight any country on trade that he thought was getting a bad deal, and India presented a massive target for the Trump administration. So we did see a real worsening from both sides. So for India imposing customs duties, these domestic sourcing regulations that were introduced. The United States revoked India's trade preferences under a program called the Generalized System of Preferences. You saw attacks on visas, H-1B visa limitations, and then some broadly applied programs the Trump administration rolled out, like tariffs on steel and aluminum that were applied worldwide, but had particularly serious impact on India, which is a major steel exporter to the United States. So you think about relations between governments on the economic front, and things have been pretty sour leading up to this point. Luckily, in the real world, you look at the actual numbers, at least pre-COVID, and they tell a much more positive story than if you were to look solely through the lens of what Washington and Delhi are yelling at each other. US-India trade, again, pre-COVID, was actually hitting all kinds of records. India continues to attract record levels of foreign direct investment. We don't know exactly how much of that comes from the United States because India's own records point to the country of last departure, and a lot of US investment is routed through Mauritius and Singapore, which have preferential tax treaties with India. So we don't know exactly what quantum of that record-breaking investment India is pulling in comes from the United States, but generally, you hear about these big numbers of US companies, particularly companies like Reliance and others that are getting co-investment from major US investors. And it's a pretty fair bet that the United States is certainly first or second in terms of partners to India on foreign investment. So the numbers are good on economic ties, but the government relations side on that has been quite sour in recent years. Now, where does that position us today? India, actually, trade with India has rebounded less quickly than a lot of our other partners, as we've seen during COVID period. India has fallen from our 9th largest trading partner to a 12th or 13th this year, most likely. So the rebound that we've seen in trade has been less prevalent with India. On the upside, India's own trade deficit this year is going to come in probably about $90 billion, which is the best that it's been since well before Modi came to office. So some of those pressures that you've seen in India that have triggered this anti-trade move are being reduced somewhat during COVID. Now we'll see if that lasts or not. Part of that depends on whether or not companies really do decide to start moving to India for global sourcing opportunities, and India begins to see its own trade patterns begin to improve. We've got some small bits of evidence that India's started to attract more global manufacturing investment, but not yet, I think, the groundswell that other countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico have really begun to pick up. But there's some signs, because with India, of course, you have a massive domestic market that's attractive, as well as hopefully being able to use India as a base for global manufacturing and exports. We've got a mini trade deal, as they call it, right? Both countries have agreed on a hopefully widening set of trade concessions that we're willing to make. This is rolling back some of the pain points that have been introduced in recent years. So when you hear a term to trade deal, this is not the same thing, as Deepa mentioned about these massive trade agreements that talk about liberalization. This is simply rolling back some of the pain points that have been introduced by both governments in recent years. It's nice to get this, but it's really in practice almost meaningless, because frankly, they're still negotiating on a package of issues that existed, 4 years ago when these talks began. Well, both countries have imposed new trade restrictions since then that are even worse. So even if we capture, these small set of trade concessions that are considered in the package, things today are still going to be worse than they were when those negotiations began. So we're actually losing ground all the time, even if we manage to capture this sort of mini deal. Pressure on the Hill, because a lot of members of Congress and Senate, the last company constituent they heard from was there to complain about these new trade barriers in India. And that's going to start to bleed over into some of the topics that Deepa had talked about, where the Hill has a more contentious relationship with India than I suspect the administration will. And when you think of issues like whether or not we're going to sanction India for the acquisition of Russian defense systems, if the waiver authority is not wide enough, if Congress needs to expand the waiver authority to consider India, then some of these trade issues are going to bleed over, I think, a little bit more directly into our, more positive security relationship. I think that if we're going to find areas of cooperation, there's got to be a bit more complementarity than simply looking at, imports minus exports. I think, as China looks to expand its global domination of manufacturing patterns in a set of modern sectors that are listed out in its Made in China 2025, I think we've got to start to rally around that, because if China dominates on autonomous vehicles, on battery storage and things like that, both of our countries are going to lose another generation of manufacturing. I think data flows is an area of trade that the Biden administration has got to focus on. Both countries are concerned about whether or not countries like China, like Russia, are soaking up vast amounts of our consumer data and could potentially use that against us in certain ways. You've seen the United States considering and India moving on data flow restrictions, but we need to make sure that data flow remains open between friends. India's IT industry, which has been a tremendous engine of the economy, particularly during COVID, that's got to stay alive and vibrant. Data flows remains the most important element of US-India commercial relations, and we got to make sure that we don't close the door to each other, even if we look at imposing some restrictions to make sure that countries that may not have our best interest at heart are soaking up all this kind of data. I think that products related to mitigation of climate change is probably going to be part of the agenda for the Biden administration. Can we look to reduce barriers so that we can all perform as well as we can in adopting renewable energy and other items that would be related to climate change? That'd certainly be high on the agenda. But overall, the Biden administration, the early years are going to be driven entirely by the response to COVID, by job losses, by recovering the economy. So I think just one fell swoop offering dramatic trade concessions and rolling back some of these issues with India is not necessarily going to be on the cards. I think more of the proactive, forward-thinking trade issues are probably going to be towards the latter half of the Biden administration. I think the early part is just stop the bleeding, stop the fighting, See if you can roll back some of the barriers and get some of these concessions pulled together. That I think is a good early part of the administration that I hope for. Over to you, Simi. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rick, for your very, very crisp analysis. So, in fact, your insights now provide an appropriate segue into the understanding of what Indian perspectives are, particularly with respect to political and defense aspect, as there occurs a transition from Modi-Trump bonhomie of the past 4 years. I now invite Professor K.P. Vijayalakshmi to offer her views. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Simi. It takes me back to be amongst friends, Deepa, Rick, and Simi. We've been associated for a long time. So sometimes many things change, but many things don't. So I'm delighted, and I'm also thankful to you for having me on this discussion. Well, Deepa and Rick have already outlined what I think is largely I would say, US perspective on some of the outstanding issues that characterize Indo US relations. Now, I don't want to talk too much about all of the overview. Deepa has done it, and Rick is focused on trade. But I will say this. I would start by outlining some propositions which I think will help you understand what India thinks. India matters is a phrase that we have been looking at for a long time. India has been characterized and categorized as a rising power, as a voice in global affairs, and America has constantly tried to do a strategic clarification in very appropriate times over the last 4 administrations. And I would say that there has been a tremendous transformation of ties, and these can't happen under just one administration. And I do agree with what Deepa said about Obama 2.0 or Obama 3. I would argue though that having people from public office who have served in the past, their adaptability to an evolving geopolitical and geoeconomic situation with a global pandemic that's raging and really leveling all the grounds that you can think of. So I think there is a sense that we would look to people with some gravitas who would understand that evolution doesn't mean throwing away, and evolution and adapting and fashioning responses should also talk about calibrating with friends, consulting with friends. We expect that to continue. And candidate Biden had said 2 or 3 things which I thought was very interesting. One was his talk of democracy promotion, and Deepa did refer to it. And I think this is actually a hopeful sign because it does talk about the importance of democracies working together. And I think there lies a solid foundation for philosophically for India and the United States to discuss in all kinds of issues and all kinds of problems that they may actually face with each other. And this is something he has said both at home, strengthening democracy both at home and abroad. So there is a certain tacit admission of certain realities that democracies face. But more than that, I think India has also been working. I want to focus really on defense cooperation as the strongest pillar that I've seen in the last 10 years that has helped transform this important partnership for India. And one of the reasons that I want to focus on defense is also because of 2 important theaters that I see Biden administration having to really focus and keep going, whether or not the focus will be on COVID pandemic management and offsetting the economic recession, if it is that's the word, or job losses and creating a social security, vaccinations, etc., etc. That will be primary for all nations concerned. But geopolitical and strategic interests remain at the core of foreign policy. And Biden has said that he would restore, he would reverse, and he would reinstitutionalize and sometimes even reject. I mean, I do this alphabet soup all the time because I think it's in a way that explains some of the limitations and the opportunities that India sees in all of this. And we see a lot of opportunities. And one of the reasons is the defense cooperation has straddled many administrations. We've also, in India, we start with the understanding that there is a bipartisan support, both in India and in the US, for a better and a more positive and a more deepening engagement between India and the United States. And I think that's an important part to remember. It's not with everybody that, countries like India and the US have this feeling. And you have a whole host of developments that can, especially in the defense sector, that has continued despite what Rick has called as several setbacks. And I've been part in some of the ways, I have been party to some of the discussions on trade, for example. One of the things I just mentioned it right now, because I would like to go back to defense. But the point is about not just disagreeing on the numbers or on the issues, but also on the kind of styles, shifting of goalposts, for example, during nuclear deal discussions that used to be the phrase that was used, and I keep seeing that happening on trade. And sometimes it's about issues like dairy products. It's about pricing of medical devices. India is a developing country, or a country with huge needs for its huge population. So there has to be some different understanding of what these trade disputes are all about. But that said, I would go back to defense cooperation and point to this fact that despite this trade friction that I kept seeing, and I was listening to all of those, defense cooperation was still moving ahead in leaps and bounds. And not only was Comcast, this GSIMOA came back, and then we are now sharing Becca. And Doklam and the current crisis with China has actually been somewhat, I would say, while not in public domain, maybe it's all in public domain. There's a lot of help given by the United States through these agreements on providing India with real actionable intelligence. So, there is this continuum that you're seeing in terms of strategic congruence and convergence, which starts way back in 2005 when there was an agreed framework of defense cooperation, and which was updated and renewed in 2015. So we do see not just these foundational agreements, but there are also what I would call as enablers. Now, why would you do an enabling mechanism kind of thing? Firstly, you start with strategic dialogue, which expanded beyond defense and went into commercial and economic. It includes that. So a partnership which is based on a mechanism of dialogue, I think that makes huge sense to believe that there will be challenges in the future, but there's going to be these mechanisms which are being thought out across the government, multi-sectoral, multi-level. There are more than 50 mechanisms of dialogues going on in energy, in space, in civil space. I mean, you can name it. In education, for example, I was going to be a party to that as well. And I cannot tell you the number of things that India and the United States are doing together. Now, I'm not saying that there are no real challenges. There will be. But I'm saying that taking the example of how defense cooperation and defense relationship, DTTI, started, and then it went on to all these enabling foundation agreements have allowed India and the United States to actually conclude an industrial security agreement, which allows for co-production and co-development of various things, which Rick talks about, is about, creating a manufacturing hub inside India. These are complementarities that you can see. So to me, I would argue that this case actually explains to you that India not only matters in the national interest of the United States, but it also for India, US matters because of the economic transformation and the kind of developmental path that we are on. We need to have this conversation more and more. And again, enablers and enabling mechanisms on both sides have created a insulation from political feuding, if you like. I've heard this term that India might become a political football. I'm not so sure because I think over the years of my research on congressional hearings, just as a matter of record, there have been continuous sort of articulation of why India should be promoted and why India should be considered and why India's democracy is so valuable in its constant, or in its fight, or in its facing the challenge of China. And I think one of the understandings that India has is now there is a pan-American sentiment that has crystallized on the China threat. So with the bipartisanship and the Pan-American and the Indian sense of China as a domineering power, you do see more complementarities that can perhaps help you navigate some real trade issues. And trade issues are about domestic politics, and they're also about deep domestic interests. So there is bound to be a little bit of argument, and this has been going on for several years. But at no time have we seen the level of um, uh, what shall I say, reassurance or the kind of public statements from both sides that, look, you're going to get a deal. There is talks going on. We are coming very close. We are going to find some way out of this. So you do see some effort from the establishment on both sides to explain that these are matters of discussion and they need the domestic consensus to be built. Sometimes you need time to do that, and so on and so forth. So I think there is a lot of stuff that you can look forward to. And now Biden, both in Indo-Pacific and in Afghanistan, I think there is a lot that we are seeing. And yesterday, the Chief of Defense Staff, General Rawat, said that in the Indian Ocean region, India is a dominant power. Without India, I don't think you can even talk about what's going to be the future of this huge span space that you're talking about. Conceptually, both US and India, not only has US done this Indo-Pacific command, but it's also conceptually agreed with India from Africa to, all of that. There's a lot of change even in the nomenclature, and the Indo-Pacific strategy from the United States maintains that India is central to its policy. And therefore, I expect that to be continued because Biden is not going to find any change in terms of the geographic or the geopolitical and the geostrategic interest and the geoeconomic interest in Indo-Pacific. That's one. The second thing is in Afghanistan. Now, I want to talk about a little bit about Afghanistan because defense cooperation doesn't directly deal with Afghanistan because it's mostly about troop withdrawals and such like. But India's centrality or India's main, not centrality, but I would say at least India has now become a major player in this. Now, with our knowledge of what Pakistan always wants, to keep India out, I was very interested to see that Indian envoy actually attended the Doha talks between US and the Taliban, which we had never done before, and there is a huge um, diffidence about trusting Taliban. But there are moves from Taliban as well. So India's experience in Afghanistan would also be of great help, I think, to the Biden administration. And Biden has said that while he favors, as Deepa said, there are some continuities in almost some of these policies. Withdrawal of troops is an eventual goal, but he wants to end the wars responsibly. So we feel that there is again a certain amount of ground in which India and the United States can actually calibrate and consult and talk about what the Afghan government, because the process of peace in Afghanistan has to be Afghan-led and Afghan oriented. So Afghan government versus Taliban is not a good way to consider, to conduct the peace negotiations. There has been a breakthrough, whether it has been because of the withdrawal announcement or whether the Trump announcement of Christmas withdrawal has impacted the peace process of, the Taliban saying, all right, if that's the way you're going to go, we can wait, pal. The red lines that need to be crossed. Oh, I can talk about that during the Q&A. But my point is that India has been intrinsically and interestedly willing to look at the Afghan question in its totality. And given India's own experience and connections with Afghanistan, India would make a very valuable partner in this exercise. And this, I'm afraid, cannot wait. Foreign policy is away from the national tensions that, that are affecting governments around the world, especially given the COVID pandemic. We have other issues in India. But foreign policy is also a continuum. It cannot wait for things to happen because it has to be also a process-driven and mechanism-based to achieve progress and to arrive at outcomes that you want. And that requires, again, finally, my point is about multilateralism. Deepa and Rick did talk about in different aspects of multilateralism and how Biden has constantly referred to strengthening allies and partners and so on. We expect that in multilateralism, we think the Europeans are going to play a very big role now, but the European understanding of China has changed. I have been listening. I mean, I was in some discussions with them, and it seems that the EU's characterization of China as a systemic rival and in technology level, and we have a lot of research in our department that is looking at this technology dominance question and power controls between US and China. And I think, you're going to see a lot of change from the European Union as well. And there's going to be a much more emphasis on a broader and a bigger coalition to actually face the China challenge. It's not going to be waiting, because China will not wait. China will also continue to do what it wants to do. It may do things in anticipation, or it may do it in reaction, or it may even do something. And I just listened to something yesterday. Somebody said from China that, one of the mistakes could have been the Wolf Water diplomacy. So you may see a change in that. But China's behavior also gets other countries to respond. So you will see a continuous thrust by the Biden administration. And India hopes that there are four things that they will do. One is that India is going to be in the UN Security Council, it's going to be in WHO, it's going to be in so many of these bodies, and we expect to see our complementarities arrive at a very fruitful partnership in our actions forward. But I think what's important for us to remember is that during crises, especially in the last two Doklam and in the Ladakh ongoing crisis, a lot of help from the United States through these defense agreements and this industrial security, and I said I can talk about it more, but that's already started in UP and Tamil Nadu, corridors, industrial defense corridors. Huge possibilities and almost actualization of those. COVID has put a break on some of these things, but these are going to go on. So I think you're seeing a chale saath saath, if you will. Forward together we go. Is I know it sounds very sort of a catchphrase, but the fact is we are in it together, and I think there is going to be a further transformation of Indo-US ties under Biden also, because I think Biden, as he's been called as an old friend, Hilale Pakistan, something, he's got a civilian honor there. And I also read in China that he once had a dinner in a noodle shop, and so he's an old friend. Well, for India, he's an old India hand. So we do know that he knows India and we know him. So I do see much more possibilities. There are limitations, I would say. There are huge limitations in not understanding each other in terms of the dairy products in trade, for example. I'm just mentioning small sectoral things, but there are bigger ones in data, localization of data, solar, etc. But we can overcome together. So thank you very much. And I know I overshot my time, but thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vijay Lakshmi, for your wonderful insights. And yes, covering the entire Indian perspectives was, of course, a little, it needed to be explained, as you very well explained. Thank you so much. So we now move to the second round of question and answers. We'll start with the question and answers. My first question is to Professor Deepa. As to, you spoke about China in your initial remarks, and increasingly China has come out as an aggressive nation who is unwilling to play by the rules. Would this contribute towards making India a best friend of America? As we know, Biden has said in 2019 during his campaign that he doesn't consider China much of a competition and that they are not bad folks. So but Trump, as we know, right from the beginning of 2015 campaigning as well, that he had upped his ante against China. Would this temperamental change on how China is viewed by the American president have its impact on how US sees India? In other words, to put it bluntly, as long as China remains a country of concern to US policy, there would be large space and high value to the relations between India and US. Your take on this, Professor Ollapally?
Yes, okay. The big question, and I touched on it a little bit, but let me just begin by saying that even if China were to drop off the face of the earth right now, the US-India relations will remain strong. I think we have to, at one level, de-link US-India relations from China, and so that it does not become the only driver. I mean, I think in the past, even when you look at US-India relations and where the big breakthrough came, it came under the Clinton administration back in 2001, when Bill Clinton announced the big emerging markets and the need for US to reach out to these markets. It was the rise of India as an economic force that really, in my view, shifted American interest. Okay, that's one. And even today, I think that American enthusiasm for engaging with India will be critically important in terms of how successful Indian economics is. How well India does economically is probably its best foreign policy. And a successful foreign economic policy for India will be the best foreign policy, period. All right. Now, that said, the China factor over the last decade has become more and more important. And now I think it's inextricably tied to the US-India relations, to an extent that perhaps even 5 years ago, one would not have thought. But, and this is not just a autonomous movement by India and US toward each other, it's a reaction to what China has been engaging in, and its wolf warrior diplomacy, its assertiveness, its coercion. These are becoming more and more open. And whereas the harmonious and peaceful rise rhetoric that Chinese had been talking about and using in some sense to grow in an economic system which was globalizing, very open, it allowed, and also I must say, under the Obama period, when even though there was the 2011 pivot to Asia for the Indo-Pacific, which was a big change, 60% of US forces were now going to be moved into the Indo-Pacific. So there was a real change in that. But what happened? Syria happened, the Middle East happened, and for a long period, again, the emphasis and the focus shifted. So at that time, the Chinese also managed to gain its presence and power in the region. So I think the fact is that currently, the Chinese have ongoing disputes with a variety of neighbors, not just India, but Japan, Vietnam, South China Sea issues, and with the United States. And so I think what you're going to see is a closer and closer nexus between US and India on China. Having said so, the Quad military exercises, the new understanding that post-COVID, the over-concentration of supply chains in China and the security threat that poses, that's a new element. So things are getting worse, not better in terms of the China threat. And I think that is going to be an additional factor, a stronger factor than the initial economic thrust, the drive that got India and US, I think, the first breakthrough. But the thing that's going to sustain it is absolutely the Indo-Pacific, the China, and the fact that neither want a China-dominated Asia. And I think that's the key. Is that possible? Well, this is where I want to come back to that, the fact that, Obama's TPP, which was one of the key ways in which US was going to engage with Indo-Pacific and India and other countries in the region, it's gone. And so the real question India should be asking is, how is the United States going to re-engage in the Indo-Pacific? Because if it's US is not able to do it, will the regional countries step up to that? What does that look like? India has been, in my view, pretty absent in recent years from, whether it's ASEAN, all of these countries are fairly dissatisfied with India, given that it didn't join RCEP, for example. So I think, my own view is that something has substantially changed, especially on the India-China border, the fallout of that. I think India now sees its China as much more of a threat than an opportunity. And I think so far, India had been insulating its economic relations with China from its strategic. And the post-Galwan period, you see that also sort of going away, so that India is now reacting both in economics and in strategic, just like the United States is also doing both economics and strategic. And if you see more and more countries doing that, Australia, for example, I think that's going to be it will be a big driver for US India, not just US India, but Indo-Pacific countries.
Great. Thank you. Professor Vijay Lakshmi, would you like to respond to it?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Am I audible?
You're very faint.
Am I audible?
No, you're not audible.
Not really.
Am I audible now?
Very faintly.
A little bit.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Vijay Lakshmi, you raised your, yes. Would you like to respond to Professor Deepa's views?
No,
Or?
if you want Rick to come in at this point, but I thought, I have something I'd like to add or, say something on this.
Okay, you could just go ahead.
Okay.
And then we'll come
So
back to another question.
Sorry, Rick, if it's okay with you. I do apologize, but I find that my thoughts flipped very quickly. See, the race in Indian Ocean region, like General Rawat said, is going to be for strategic basing. And therefore, Quad has not only become forget the talk shop, they have actually, we've signed a number of, as I said, the framework to understand deepening relationship between all these countries in the Indian Ocean region is going to be through the enabling mechanisms. And one is that we've signed trilateral agreements, we've signed bilateral and other acquisition agreements, training agreements with Japan, with Vietnam. We've done a number of things, and we are doing a number of things. So my point is that while we talk about China threat, we are also talking about a free and open and inclusive. Now, when you say inclusive, we are thinking of bringing in the ASEAN centrality. In the last 2+2 ministerial dialogue that we had in a few weeks ago, a lot of statements were made clarifying how India and US are going to look at Indo-Pacific, Pakistan, calling out Pakistan on its terrorist, calling out Pakistan on how to handle the attacks on URI, etc. Then on Afghanistan, and recognizing India's economic assistance and development given to Afghanistan. So this ministerial dialogues are going to be something that we should look for in the future, because I think this is a mechanism that's not going to be really buffeted in terms of what should be the way forward. But at the same time, I would say the China threat has changed, not only because of its economic architecture that is built through BRI and other RCEP and others, but it's also about the recognition of the debt trap, the recognition of China as a revisionist power, if you like. And of course, the national security strategy and the national defense strategy of the United States clarifies their entire take on this. But India too has very clearly said that RCEP has been a problem for our national interests because of territorial sovereignty issues. It's not about economics in some cases. So China cannot just waive this whole character of economic sort of integration and benefits to be together and bury territorial and sovereignty issues with its neighbors or with its other, powers in the region. And I think the ASEAN centrality is also going to take a big fillip out of this, because India has been insisting on that. All of India's statements come out on that. But my point is that China cannot now have business as usual. COVID has changed that. And I think the economic evolution of these economic corridors that China builds is going to be a very big factor in many countries, including our neighbors in South Asia, understanding what it really means. So, it's not just that, you want to be in some regional economic architecture, just build it, so be there, be there. So I would argue that India's absence has been well thought out, and there's a lively debate, by the way, within India on whether we should have not lost this choice, et cetera, in OTSEP, or did we do the right thing? The fact remains that it was a decision India took on very solid grounds. It was an easy decision to make, but it was a decision that was taken by a very solid based argument. And second thing about China threat in India, India fights China in its borders. Again, the border equation between India and China. You can hear a lot of public domain, arguments and articulation by the Indian government saying that, look, China is now changing the same idea of, giving 5 different explanations of why it did what it did. So these are difficult issues. Talks are going on, but for me, I would argue that India welcomes more countries to recognize how difficult the challenge of China is, and to therefore to join together. And as I see from General Rawat's statement, I think you are going to see the need for unmanned aerial systems, for example, more fighter aircraft, and other defense capabilities, and things like Becca and others that we're sharing with the United States. And by the way, CATSA. And I think even in CATSA, you find that there was a waiver granted. Now I don't know how broad or how narrow the waiver jurisdiction or authority is going to be, but the fact is that US understands that this is something India has to do to protect its own flanks. We do face a problem on our borders. So, there's a different logic and there's a different articulation about the China threat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Vijay Lakshmi, for your intervention. I would now pose my question to Mr. Rick. Thank you for waiting so patiently. Actually, Professor Deepa just said that economic policy would be the best foreign policy between US and India. So taking from there, the human relationship between India and US has actually been the backbone of the economic relationship. For instance, as you mentioned, software and the offshore connections, the bilateral trade in goods, services, and also merchandise. These appear to be fairly resilient. However, the US businesses have long demanded the ease of doing business in India, and the two countries have also conflicted at the WTO with the subject of agricultural subsidies and sanitary and phytosanitary standards, etc., still in a limbo. What would US businesses seek under a Biden administration, given that India's own economic performance has dwindled quite a bit in the last 1 year? Has India's market and its sheen been on the losing ground, as according to US interests? And also, how do we see the limited trade deal moving forward? Because there was a much of noise that was made during President Trump's visit to India, vis-a-vis India's own policy of Atmanirbhar Bharat, or self-resilient, self-reliant India. Your take on that, Mr. Rick, over to you.
Yeah, a lot in there. That pretty much captures most everything that's happening. Well, I think in terms of how businesses view Modi, we have a very stochastic model for looking at kind of the pace of reforms, right? We have a reform scorecard that we refresh every time that a new Indian government comes to office. And you can measure sort of the pace of reform over time. And what we saw was, when Prime Minister Modi was first elected 6.5 years ago, that first year of his first term, was a tremendous pace of significant reforms. We think sometimes of reforms really kind of boiling down to GST and to the bankruptcy law, but actually a lot of other areas that had actually been really important areas of friction between the United States and India, like administration of taxation, oil and gas exploration reforms, a lot of really significant reforms that happened that first year in office. During Modi's entire first term, of the 30 reforms that we track, they actually completed 9 of those reforms during its term in office, but 6 of the 9 were the first year. So out of the gates, very fast. And then a real slowdown. And that slowdown persisted, into the beginning of the second term, when you saw a tilt towards, some of the kinds of changes domestically that would appease, more of the Hindu nationalist base of the party. But, during COVID, we've actually seen the government recommit itself to reforms, some that are very contentious, like the agriculture reforms that took place, the labor market reforms that took place just before that, liberalizing foreign direct investment in defense, some areas that were extremely difficult, politically, hot button issues, but choosing, the crisis of COVID to take some of these steps that, a lot of folks have been calling for and waiting for quite some time. You do see, in terms of foreign direct investment, the numbers are really starting to move up again. In the middle of COVID, India's pulled in $55 billion of FDI in the last 12 months. That's more than double-digit percentage rise from what it was the 12 months before COVID. So, because of reforms, because of capital looking for new homes, you've actually seen that money start to gravitate towards India. But there's also an important, I think, understanding that we all need to I think, internalize about India, which is, when you talk about India's success as a market, as a place to position manufacturing and such, at the end of the day, we dramatically overemphasize the role that New Delhi plays in that. It's so much about what did Modi do today? What did they have for breakfast? What reforms have they done? If you're talking to real businesses, and you talk about the features that make a business make or break in India, most of that is what happens at the state level. States control your access to electricity, to water. States can strengthen or worsen labor market reforms. Do you have roads? Do you have ports? All of this is almost completely governed by India's state governments. And it's another area that the Modi government has moved into that I think, while it's not a reform per se, but it's very important to improve transparency and accountability of state governments. They're doing these rankings of Indian states' business environment. Now, look, you got to take it all with a grain of salt. They did 3 rounds of it during his first term, and then they had a gap of 3 years. By the third round, most states were at 90-95% of the way to like a perfect business environment, because they self-report. I'm sure they're, overstating, some of the domestic reforms that they take into the state level. But they did just issue, for the first time in 3 years, another ranking of Indian states' business environment. And I think for all of us, to continue to add transparency and accountability for what India's state governments are going to do. State governments, more than the central government by far, are going to be the focus on pulling India out of a COVID tailspin. And they're going to be the ones that define India's development trajectory over the next 10, 15 years. The central government, sure. I mean, highly regulated industries like financial services and insurance, the central government regulators are crucial. Areas like trade policy, and areas, there are a few remaining areas that have FDI caps, sure, central government crucial. But everything else that's going to make or break the market is almost completely determined by the state governments. And that's why you see huge disparities between, the relative development and prosperity that you see in some states versus others. So in terms of India's market attractiveness, I think, taking the lens off Delhi a little bit and putting it on Patna and Lucknow and Bhubaneswar and places like that, is something that, we all need to spend a little bit more time doing, because the answers about how successful India is going to be in attracting these global investors and stuff lies more in these state capitals in a lot of ways than it does in Delhi. That's it on that front, Simi.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your crisp analysis. My question to Professor Vijay Lakshmi, if you'd allow. Ma'am, in the, my question to you is, how will a Biden administration deal with the Modi government and vice versa? In the sense that Indo US relationship has been so institutionalized that a change in US administration will not have any impact at all or whether Biden as a president will continue to regard India as a major strategic partner, or will there be some major challenges in the wheels of the strategic partnership? If you could briefly respond to this. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Simi. That was a good question. And I think there are three things that I'd like to say. The first is institutionalization. You talked about how that can insulate. I did mention that it insulates to some extent from the political feuding of coalitions that support a president, whether it is from Republican side or from the Democrat side. And Democrats' umbrella coalition, you're seeing the pressures of this even in appointments. But I think the USTR is going to play a very important role in that. And one of the things that India would look for is to see whether there is any traction or there's going to be movement on this dialogue on withdrawing of GSP. And I think that would set the tone for bringing back the focus on both economic and defense cooperation that we expect to continue. But to the larger question, whether there is going to be a major change or there's going to be some difference in nuances, no, because look at the kind of things that has already taken place. One is the strategic trade authorization 1 status. That gives you special license exceptions to also buy from countries that US sells to. And all we need to do is make up our minds whether we want to get it from France, So there's a lot of things that has opened up because of STA 1 category. We are a major defense partner. So I think, again, I want to come back to the defense procurement. There are two things that India did, which really helped in this enabling process. One is it allowed for private sector, public-private sector partnership in defense. And that's a very big step for India. I have written a report on this and, it's available. The second is also our acquisition process. There's been a constant change in that. So these kind of institutional within the country steps have allowed the dialogue parameters and the the conversations. Over 50 dialogues are going on. So I don't see that, the Biden administration is going to find it easy to say, no, we're not going to do all this because there's this problem that I'm thinking of. But where the trade negotiations, it'll depend a large extent on the USTR. And I think there's a new person, Tai, or somebody who's got a lot of expertise on many things. So we'll have to wait and see. But I think your question on whether there is going to be a centrality of India in US's, let's say, South Asia strategy, I think there will be. That will be continued, and that will have to be one of the building blocks on which both Biden and Modi governments will be talking to. The second is the continued cooperation and deepening of defense cooperation will have a cascading effect on the rest of the dialogues that we are having. And the third is India expects to see the commitment on the continued momentum on Indo-Pacific, which could include a new form of thinking on the economic architecture that we'd like to see or build, and of course a commitment to a comprehensive multinational defense, because the Trump administration's articulation was comprehensive strategic partner, global strategic partnership with India. But right now, I think we're looking at comprehensive multilateral defense as well, for which Biden has been committing to multilateralism. So I think Indo-Pacific has a very good opportunity, presents a very good opportunity to take forward a kind of a plan in which India would be the dead center, or the linchpin, if you like, in the 2012 characterization of Leon Panetta of the security provider kind of thing. So, but in all these respects, therefore, I think Biden and Modi government will have a lot more to talk to each other and do business with each other than to sit back and say, well, let's see, first let's do other things. And then I think this will be, there will be an interest in continuing this momentum.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your response. I hope I am audible. Thank you so much, ma'am. So my question to Professor Ollapally is that, a lot has been said that incoming President Joe Biden would be very much of a foreign policy president. He has mentioned a lot about rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, as you have mentioned, and also the World Health Organization. The first two are the Obama era actions. And so do you think that there could be a rejuvenation of the pivot to Asia strategy, or the Indo-Pacific strategy, of course, is going to take a lead, as you have mentioned right in the beginning? Or do you also see a hyperactive Quad under President Biden? The organic bonhomie between Trump and Modi, that was, can this be nurtured between Biden and Modi as well? To pursue an Indo-Pacific strategy, the definition as it goes in the geopolitics of the region. So your views on this, ma'am. Over to you.
Okay, thanks for that question, Simi. Individual leaders are obviously very, very important. And the chemistry between these leaders are sometimes can overcome certain other obstacles. But what's interesting is that, during the campaign, there was a sense that Modi and the Indian government would have preferred perhaps Trump victory rather than a Biden because of a variety of reasons. But what was interesting is that Modi was very quick to tweet out to Biden and calling him an old friend, close old friend, basically stating, charting out the new path very clearly right away. And, and he is an old friend, because for 8 years he was with Obama, and I think they know each other quite well. So I think the personal bonhomie is not going to be an issue, really speaking. Excuse me. But whether or not India is going to be, I think the main question is going to be, how is Biden going to re-engage? He has a lot of work to do, both internally, just the COVID, the economic crisis, but also rebuilding American reputation and American engagement in the multilateral arena. Just think of all the different agenda items he's going to have that were literally trashed by the Trump administration. He's going to have to, so in that sense, I think, climate is going to be, he's made certain promises. Climate change is one of them. Definitely, and he's already appointed John Kerry as the climate envoy, so you can see how important that is. And that will be very important for India as well, but that's not the key thing for India. I think coming back to how they're going to re-engage in the Indo-Pacific really will be key, because right now what I see is a fragmentation in the Indo-Pacific. To what extent the Quad can suddenly become this hyperactive group, it could theoretically, but one has to understand also that, when you look at the Indo-Pacific, the US having appeared to withdraw a bit has let it kind of become fragmented, kind of various bubbles with different countries. So it's going to be a difficult thing to come up with mechanisms where you have it both, the main countries will be able to work together without alienating one or the other. I mean, I think you have all these multilaterals, minilaterals, trilaterals. What do they all add up to? I think it's going to have to be done very carefully. Perhaps what I see is an issue-based coalitions. So it could work out that it won't be necessarily a kind of a huge inclusive Indo-Pacific coalition of countries, but maybe Quad-like smaller groupings based on issues. So whether it's trade or investment, digital economics, supply chain, security, those will have certain organic groups that come together. The trick is to make sure that India and the US are in those groupings that do emerge, and which I think could be the way to re-engage in a significant, meaningful way in the Indo-Pacific, not just the Quad. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Deepa, for your wonderful response. Thank you so much. My last question before we move on to the audience's question for the next 10 minutes is to Mr. Rick. Mr. Rick, you know, given the pandemic and the entire mess that it has created, Joe Biden's election campaign focused much on lowering the healthcare costs and localizing the manufacturing of drugs in the US, or even importing prescription drugs from Canada where the prices are significantly lower. So there is a sort of unease in the Indian pharma sector. Do you see that the Indian government is actually negotiating to make it a preference country under the GSP to supply generics to the US? What commercial policy shifts do you recommend for Indian pharma to remain actually competitive in the US?
I think some of our countries and India's worst fears early and midway through the pandemic weren't exactly met, which is concerns that every country would basically ring fence medicines and equipments in a substantial way and limit, you know, the export in areas where maybe they had excess production even then to other countries. You saw some steps, you know, India, for instance, put a ban on the export of some active pharmaceutical ingredients, which were important for, you know, the production of medicines, but later rolled that back and didn't apply it for, you know, for companies that needed an exemption at the time. So I'd say overall, the worst fears about everybody ring fencing equipment and pharmaceuticals during this period, you know, has not yet really sort of come to pass. I think there's wide recognition that, you know, India, which has focused its entire pharmaceutical industry on driving down the cost of production. If it's low cost medicines that you want, you know, India will remain the pharmacy to the world in a lot of ways. You know, for generic medicines, for, you know, even some novel medicines that sometimes are produced by license, even when these the molecules are actually discovered by foreign companies, and vaccine production as well. So no, I'm not too concerned about a dramatic imposition of some kind of new trade barriers moving pharmaceuticals and medical supplies between our two countries. You do start to begin, you know, you saw this, the creation of a, you know, kind of a Quad plus construct during the COVID crisis, where the Deputy Secretary of State, Steve Biegun, was getting together with Quad plus a few other countries to talk about, you know, our connectivity and ability to work together to head off some of the more damaging aspects in terms of healthcare delivery during the COVID pandemic. There's conversations about, you know, whether or not our pharmaceutical industries can jointly begin looking for other sources of API production, because a lot of the pharmaceutical ingredients are produced in China, and, you know, concerned that China, you know, during we've seen this when periods of increased tensions, China does directly use economic clout for a lot of its military security ambitions. In terms of you know, stopping imports, potentially threatening to reduce exports of vital elements like different kinds of metals and materials that are used for production of technology goods and stuff. So I don't see any alternative to continuing to source and supply a lot of low-cost medicines from India. GSP you asked about, I mean, GSP right now is currently revoked with India. So whether they would bring in pharmaceuticals as part of a restored GSP, I'm just not familiar, and it's so far down the road. I don't think that's going to be part of the initial conversations, because GSP as a total, of course, has been revoked. But I think that healthcare cooperation actually could be one of the elements of more positive movement here because of this deputies conversation that's already begun. I suspect the Biden administration is going to want to continue that and look to expand it. And finding other sources for production of the necessary ingredients is going to be pretty important. So I think the relationship is too solid, too strong. The business fundamentals are good enough. I think, you know, U.S. pharmaceutical majors, they use India's pharmaceutical firms. This is a lifeblood for them of producing and exporting to the United States. So there's enough momentum there where I'm not too concerned about this, you know, becoming more sand in the gears. And in fact, healthcare cooperation, I think, is one of the areas where you may see an increase in cooperation going forward.
Sure, certainly. And as one of our attendees have mentioned that perhaps the next visit, either it is Howdy Modi or Namaste Biden, it would be a COVID vaccine diplomacy. So certainly it is going to be up the game.
You know, I've already patented the term Dillyware. So if Delhi and Delaware come together, Dillyware. But we'll see if that sticks.
Wow, amazing. Thank you. Thank you for that. So coming to the last bit, we just have 2 to 3 minutes. If you could spend 1 minute each, respected panelists. Professor Deepa, what are your views on what are the sectors or areas which would be the priority list for both countries to work together for the next immediate, perhaps next 2 years, first 2 years of Biden administration that would strengthen the relationship? If you could just list them.
Okay, let's see. I think they would probably want to build on existing strengths. I don't see, under the current circumstances for the first 2 years, them trying to chart out big, new, ambitious projects. I don't see that. They don't have the time for that. They don't have the attention for that either. And so I think, as I've said before, and as Vijay also mentioned, the defense relations will be continuing to be the one that is pushed, just because they know those are low-hanging fruit. And both sides, I think the new administration will want to have some low-hanging fruit to be able to show success. And so the DTTI and the joint industry collaboration that has been set up in defense, they'll probably push, they should be pushing that, but there's still a lot of bureaucratic hurdles. Despite what Professor Vijay said, there is a lot of bureaucratic obstacles in the way of that. The second thing is, of course, COVID diplomacy. I think that's just a given that, you know, what Rick just mentioned about the pharma, and you were talking about the pharmaceutical sector. Clearly, there is a way in which that should be pushed ahead. And finally, number 3, I think the bigger idea of offshoring from China with the supply chain oversupply of concentration and the vulnerability of supply chains, that I think India will need to push a bit harder to be able to reap the benefits of relocation, because it hasn't had that yet. And I think it can be something where we could get some quick results, perhaps, under smart economic policy. So those would be my 3 things.
Great. If you could just allow a follow-up on that, because there is one question that is directed to you about Biden administration's commitment to the normative standards. And in fact, he has expressed his dissonance about India's government of India's stance towards Kashmir. So how much is India going to tolerate US focus on Kashmir and other issues like minority rights and freedom of speech and expression in the rest?
Okay, good question. I think the question of values, you know, if you look at philosophically the Biden team, I think they're multilateralist, internationalist, and value-driven. And so the value that they give most importance to is democracy. And he has already said democracy at home and abroad. And I think he's serious about that. It's not just a rhetoric. And so in that case, you can just look at in the past, in Congress, some of the Democrats have been very strong on Kashmir, on the CAB, and on the NRC questions. For example, Pramila Jayapal just became the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. She and Jaishankar had a little, you know, a slight sideshow where there was a misunderstanding, controversy, whatever, when Jaishankar came last year and Pramila Jayapal was part of a congressional group that was supposed to meet with him, and he wanted her off that because she had pushed a resolution urging India to lift restrictions in Kashmir. The congressional group said they won't do that, so he didn't meet with them. At that point, Kamala Harris came out in support of Jayapal. So that just to say that if it's not Biden himself, there will be others on the in the administration, in Congress, who will make a push for it, and they'll just have to deal with it. I mean, I think their relationship is mature enough that they're going to be able to talk this out. And I said, one of the things I said was that the Biden team will listen more to the partners in a serious way. And I'm assuming the Indian side will too, because it's in both countries' interest to do this, promote democracy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. My question next is to Mr. Rick about will Biden administration move along the path of Trump's slogan of America first? And if yes, so how easy will it be for Indians staying there or even Indians who are planning to move to America?
Well, I think there's two elements that I think get swallowed up into that. You know, part of it is restrictions on immigration. Part of it is, you know, the focus on trying to rebirth American manufacturing, right? That's a core element of America First. And I think the rebirth of manufacturing will still be there. I don't think that they're going to wield it as a club quite the same way that the Trump administration had done. You know, just these offhand remarks that would sometimes, you know, be drivers of policy, like you know, complaining about India's high customs duties on Harley Davidsons, you know, things that, you know, just the last thing that comes in the president's ear becomes the next thing he says in the speech. You're going to see a lot less of that, a lot less this herky-jerky motion on you never know what's the next thing on the agenda. I think, you know, agendas in terms of the issues that we want to see on trade matters and manufacturing are going to be, you know, a little bit developed a little bit more through normal policy channels, a little bit more rigid, a little bit more, you know, open for discussion in some ways. But overall, you know, at least for the first couple of years, as we try to pull our economies out of the COVID tailspin, you know, issues like Make in India, you know, the United States is not going to be launching dramatic programs to promote, you know, companies that are looking to set up manufacturing elsewhere and such. So there's still going to be a bit of a gap, you know, Make in India, you know, we won't call it Make America Great Again, but certainly the Biden administration wants to make sure that you see a rejuvenation of American manufacturing, because even though we are a services-driven economy, you know, people still picture and envision putting things together as what the economy looks like, and so you're going to see that. But on immigration, you know, I suspect you're going to see relaxation. You know, you've heard that likely this the ban on the freeze on H-1Bs will likely be lifted. Will they increase the cap? Things like that is a little bit tough to see. President Trump never quite got around to revoking this Obama era rule on spousal worker visas. So some of the damaging things too that I think have been put on the table there, you know, weren't enacted, or at least not yet. I mean, I guess we still have a few weeks here. So I suspect less pressure on immigration as we've seen. But I think on manufacturing, you know, you see less kind of belligerence in the way that we talk about manufacturing. But this overall on like trying to promote domestic manufacturing first, I think that'll stay very much part of the agenda, at least for the first part of the foreseeable future as we pull out of COVID.
Sure, thank you so much. So one last question to Professor Vijay Lakshmi from the audience. From where should India buy its defense equipment, whether it is from US or from Russia, or maybe I would like to add whether it is creating an Atmanirbhar in defense sector as well. Your quick take on it.
Well, you answered part of it, which is to build indigenous capacities and capabilities is going to be the goal. But there is no real binary here of buying either from Russia or from the United States. We've made the transition. We used to have maximum Russian, defense items from Russia. But today it's come down quite significantly. We are almost at close to $18 billion with the United States. So we are moving in some ways, very critical ways, we are moving towards expanding our supplies on defense equipment. So it's, for me, it's not a binary. Where it's needed, we will take it because we have multi-role, multi-sectoral, and multi-level engagements with so many countries. And also our threats are not exactly the same in every place. But the real issue is about the edge on technology. And again, I refer to you to the current chief of defense staff, general, talking about how technology will not be only for destruction, but it can be for deterrence. So technology matters to India. And so getting technology edges is what is going to guide India's defense policies. And for that, the SDA-1, the major defense partner, plus NDS 2018, NSS 2017, and the foundational agreements, plus the enablers that I've mentioned on both sides, a lot of this does indicate that we are serious about getting the best that is going to suit our defense requirements and threat perceptions. So there's no binary here, where if it is needed, and we have actively pursued diplomacy, and if I may actually also answer some of the points that you had raised earlier with the other panelists, one of the reasons why I'm also looking at the Biden administration as being beset with some of the other problems is what I read about as reformers versus restorers inside the Biden coalition. So, you're going to see a lot of that going on. I mean, even for the DefSec, there was quite a bit of that jockeying by the Black Caucus and et cetera, et cetera. So world is aware of all of that. But then the point for which I have argued today is that defense cooperation will provide the momentum for us to ride over issues on pharma, for example, issues on solar, issues on green energy. We may come together on climate. I think we will have a lot more common ground and way to deal with China in terms of other things that China does. But in terms of actual procurement, we have changed our procurement policy to such an extent that we can buy from different sources. And on top of it, your first point that Atmanirbhar. Well, we have said now the private sector is going to be producing defense equipment for us. That was a very big sea change and enabler. The more you see of private sector coming in, Indian private sector, you're going to see a lot more energy, a lot more traction in the kind of thing. And final point is, we all are forgetting that, decoupling may be difficult from China. It has been, the conventional argument is that they're so entwined, there's never going to be any full decoupling. Nobody's talking about full decoupling. This overwhelming and very undesirable, emphasis on buying everything from China. I mean, that's something India is the only country, I think. So, I mean, India has said that, no, we are not going to buy these things. We are going to stop this. We are going to stop that. We're going to stop this. So you are seeing Indian position on certain things as a kind of, strategic autonomy being practiced in its decision making. There is a certain sense of self-interest as well as national interest, which says that, look, whether other countries do this or not, we need to take a call right now on this because we haven't completely decoupled. We cannot justify, because we believe in WTO and we also believe in other international institutions, unlike China, which said, if the judgment is not according to me, then I don't believe that judge is fair. So that's not the way Indians work. We accept international arbitrations. We do many things. So my point is that we will believe in a self-reliant India and take some decisions which are not very palatable. But it is also our case that we will be willing to engage more and more, and engage hopefully with the Progressive Caucus as well as the government and other caucuses, so as to, early engagement is what I would advocate to India. And I think, that would yield us a far better exchange of narratives and opportunity to explain why India does some of the things that it does. And I think that's something very promising, and I hope that's what is going to come out in the future.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for this wonderful and productive discussion. We had a number of questions, but we couldn't take all these questions. So perhaps we can collate it and we could share it across over your emails. On this note, I believe that as long as we remain transparent in our relationship, the sense is that we can, I think, easily navigate through the challenges and move forward in strengthening the Indo US relations.
Thank you, Simi.
So I am so thankful. Sorry, ma'am, were you saying something?
No, I'm just saying that from your own understanding of Indo-US agricultural cooperation, right, we have traced the level of, difficulties we faced and yet came across. And, your own research is, I think, a very clear indication of how India works.
Absolutely. Yes, that is a standing testimony, actually, to navigate through the challenges, yet being resilient to constraints. So thank you, ma'am, for your intervention on that. I take this opportunity to thank my respected panelists, Professor Deepa Ollapally, Mr. Rick Rossow, and Professor KP Vijay Lakshmi for taking off time from your busy schedules this morning and evening based on your time zones to educate us on how to reinforce the notion of stronger, India US relationship. I also extend my heartfelt gratitude on behalf of the Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies at IMPRI and the Rising Powers Initiative at Sigur Center for Asian Studies, George Washington University, Washington, DC, and our dear audience for joining us on Zoom as well as on Facebook Live. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to engaging with you again sometime in the next new year with the new administration. Thank you so much, and I wish you a very good day and good night.
Thank you, Simi.
Thank
You're
you.
on a very
Thank you,
impressive
Simi.
job
Thank you,
there.
Deepa. Thank you, Rick.
Bye-bye. Bye, Vijay. Bye-bye, Rick.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Have a nice day, everyone. Yes.